I have a sort of, this is an example actually from 20 odd years ago. I had a kid that was working, there was a squad, I was working in Australia, there was a squad of athletes, sprint athletes, pretty good caliber from probably 10.2 to 10.8 in the squad. So they were good caliber athletes. One of the athletes was probably the most powerful athlete in the group by a good margin, but he was a 10.79 100-metre runner.
Huh.
One of the slow guys in the group. But he had this phenomenal power qualities. And you put him in a double leg drop jump, he'd destroy everybody. But when we did anything single leg, he had these very weak, mushy feet, and he would collapse and would get destroyed by the 10.2 guys in the single leg stuff. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. And I probably didn't have at that point, the idea of how much you could train your feet and some of these other options that we could have done with that. So, and I kind of have some regrets for his career because he had these qualities, but he had a rate limiting step.
That was power physiologist and strength coach Angus Ross speaking on the difference between double and single leg jump stiffness and how it translates into sprinting. You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Simply Faster. Simply Faster is an online athletic performance technology shop distributing items such as the Freelap timing system, GymAware, K-Box, 1080 Sprint, and the Speed Mat. I've gotten many of these items from Simply Faster and can confidently say that they make today's best training technology available to everybody. The Freelap timing system has revolutionized both my practices and my athlete assessments, allowing me to look at the 10-meter fly capability of dozens of athletes in a matter of seconds. It is wireless, compact, portable, and incredibly versatile. The K-Box and 1080 Sprint are fantastic tools for any coach looking to build speed, agility, and implement training scenarios that go beyond the traditional weight room. The 1080 Sprint is being used by great coaches training some of the fastest sprinters in the world, and it truly represents high-performance speed training. I can personally attest that Simply Faster's customer service is second to none. Christopher at Simply Faster responds quickly to queries, and anyone who makes a purchase from Simply Faster is in good hands. If you want to acquire some of the best high-tech training equipment available, stop by simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. They are the future of coaching technology. Welcome to another episode of the Just Fly Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Joel Smith. Thanks so much for being here today. It's great to have you, and we have a guest I'm thrilled to have back on the show. He was on about a year and a half ago, and that is Angus Ross, who is a strength physiologist and strength coach at High Performance Sport, New Zealand. And so I've had about a year and a half to think up some follow-up questions for this guy. Just one of my favorite guys to talk to, not only because he's brilliant and has a wide base of knowledge in athletes he's worked with, but also because he asks a lot of the same questions that I do. In addition to his work in New Zealand, he has a PhD from University of Queensland. He's done work in Australia, and Angus has also been a Winter Olympian, an elite athlete in his own right. And I think that's where a lot of those, with all of us who have competed on a high level, I think that's where a lot of those questions start and where they come from. And so it's just so refreshing to talk with somebody who you feel like your mind is always going the same direction with where you're trying to get at, which is how do we make athletes as fast and powerful as possible, and let's make sure we've left no stone unturned in that process. And so one of the things the training means that is probably most unfamiliar to me, to be honest, has always been super maximal training, eccentric training. I feel like as an athlete myself, elastic athlete, I always got that more or less through plyometric type work, and super maximal is something I probably have had a little less personal experience with. It's something I haven't used on my athletes a whole lot. I'm not, if you watch my videos and articles, you're not going to read anecdotes and case studies from Joel Smith's super maximal methods. And so I defer to guys, great strength coaches in the field, such as Cal Dietz, and then on this episode, Angus Ross. And so as with any training method, eccentric training is just one tool for the job. So we talk about these things, but it's just one tool. But learning how it fits into the entire training scheme, the yearly periodization, its unique benefits versus plyometrics or something that also is very high tension is really valuable. So those are some of the things that Angus is going to go into today. Really the topic list is some of his new happenings, reactive strength and stiffness and sprinting. So what you heard in that little teaser in the beginning, which is honestly just fascinating, and it fits in with things like previous episodes with Alex Natera. Things are coming full circle here on the Just Fly Performance podcast. Check that one out too. You're going to really, a lot of things will connect there, especially if you work with track and field athletes and even team sport too, but just to understand the how and the why of why each of these special strength exercises are in a program. And don't just have something in just to have it in because it looks cool. There's a reason for everything. We're also going to talk about the role of maximal isometric or overcoming exercise versus the plyometric stimulus, who and when and how in terms of benefits there. We're going to talk about ways Angus has been experimenting with a more frequent alternation of the training stimulus. So doing training that is fundamentally different every week. Like what happens there? Who responds? Who doesn't? And as always, like in that relentless pursuit of trying to find the optimal training means, it's not every athlete's going to respond to the same thing. So understanding a little bit more why that's the case, we're going to go into there. We're also going to talk a little bit about fascial-driven athletes versus muscle-driven athletes and some of the specific training and ways that those two different athletes and those paradigms might be optimized. And a lot of stuff that actually goes back to last week's episode with Randy Huntington. So if you check that one out, this week's going to complement a lot of that. And I mean, it's just, I'm just like a kid in the candy shop talking to these great coaches, Randy Huntington and Angus Ross, and hearing things come together is just it's such a blessing for me on this side of the microphone and reflecting in my own training and athletes I've worked with. We're also going to talk about Angus's thoughts on velocity-based training as well as electrostimulation and strength performance. So tons of great topics, things that really come full circle with a lot of what's been on this episode in the past that answers questions that I've had. And Angus is just always great to talk to. He's one of my favorite guys to have on. So I'm really excited to get you episode 104 for his second appearance. Let's get on to the show. Angus, welcome back to the show. Thanks for being here again.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm looking forward to it. I've enjoyed some of your podcasts over the last little while. So, yeah, always good to chat. And I think that's a privilege. And, you know, I'd probably get as much out of it by having to synthesize some thoughts on some of the stuff too. So it's great.
Yeah. Well, hey, that means a lot to me that you're kind of saying that about the episodes, and it's definitely been a huge blessing on my part just to put all this together, speaking to great coaches like yourself. And it's been, like 70 episodes since we did this last. So what's been new in the world of Angus Ross in the last year and a half? Anything new in terms of athletics or anything along those realms?
I think just a few new athletes I've sort of taken on, and you know, obviously there's new learnings in that space. I've probably just subtle changes in the way we're doing things. You know, we all keep learning. You know, I've been playing more with, you know, we've talked about some of the Jay Schrader stuff and playing with some concepts there. You know, isometric work. But nothing that's, you know, entirely novel, I don't think. But yeah, I've access to some different equipment which I probably didn't have access to before, which has been helpful. So yeah, I think we're moving in the right direction. And probably some changes in the way I periodize things, but all of them, you know, relatively subtle and but I think improved from probably where I was, you know, a year ago whenever we last spoke. So yeah.
Yeah. Hey, that's one thing I just think is so cool. Every time I talk to you is you're always learning. Like, you're asking me about, and you had recommended me getting Jerome Simeon on the show. I'm so happy I took your advice. Like, that's something I really respect about you. And I'm excited to talk. I almost would call the first half of the questions I have eccentric training to be continued from the last time we talked. And so one of the things you said, it really piqued my interest. And be it eccentric training or plyometrics, just the idea of stiffness. You had mentioned an athlete who lacks stiffness could benefit from eccentric training. I think you maybe even give an example of a hurdler last time. But what are some basic ways to test and assess that from maybe more than just looking at it, but like a quantitative perspective to see if this athlete needs increased stiffness in their sport movement?
Yeah, so there's quite a few ways in a lab-based measure, which, you know, are relatively complex and complicated, which aren't necessarily going to be accessible to a lot of people. So that might involve digitization or some of these oscillation tests. But so what we typically use, however, is field tests, which have a you know, high correlation or relationship to these lab-based measures. So one of the ones is a drop jump, which probably most people have access to, either a jump mat or a high-speed camera to get ground contact time and flight time. So if you have ground contact time, flight time, and body mass, there's a paper by, I think it's the Marin Group, it's Dello et al. 2004, and I can send you that if you want to put that on show notes or anything. So they have, there's a calculation in there which you can just whack straight into Excel, and away you go. If you can get those other metrics, so that's quite good. You can do that single leg or double leg, and we've done both, trying to assess differences between legs for obviously sprint or jump athletes. The other one, which I think is again from the Marin group, the French group there, is just using sprint data itself. And if you've got, I think that calculation requires speed, ground contact time, flight time, and again probably weight. And then there's a calculation you can copy straight out, whack it into Excel, and you've got yourself a spreadsheet. I think actually Marin may put out a spreadsheet themselves, which they put on Twitter maybe a year ago or so, with some of that stuff in it. So it's pretty straightforward to get access to that stuff, and those guys have done a great job, I reckon, in terms of making it. I know you've had them on your own podcast, making this stuff accessible to the world and the wider public, I guess, the coaches that are interested. So yeah, with those things, by the time you collect a bit of data, you'll see those that are stiff and those that aren't, and it largely relates to the biggest influence on the calculation is the ground contact time. So people that get off the ground quickly generally are stiffer. No rocket science there, and we know from in most cases, if you get off the ground quickly, your stride rate is quicker. So if you work down the line, somebody's got the turnover machine, they're probably quite stiff. So yeah, and vice versa. If somebody's very compliant, they're likely to be more ground contact based, long stride length. So yeah, I mean, you can quantify it, but then the old iometer sort of test of how they perform will give you a lot of that metrics. But if you're trying to get subtle changes and assess subtle changes, I think the drop jump and that Marin calculation, I think it's Marin et al. 2005, have provided that contact, that calculation. There's certainly ways of getting more hard data, I guess, in that space that's useful.
How close do you think that is to like something like a simple RSI? So it's just a simple reactive strength index test. Like if someone gets pretty good on that, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good test, but it won't give you stiffness per se, because that'll give you, it's almost a power measure. That is what that gives you, how quickly you produce and how high you jump. So I really like that as a generic measure of athleticism or elasticity, but it's not stiffness per se. So you obviously have but that said, that probably will relate to performance in an applied task more so than stiffness will, but it might not tease out the different bits and pieces. So yeah, if they achieve a good RSI through a very small contact time, then they're probably stiff. But yeah, it's not exactly the same, but it possibly is more relative to general performance anyway.
Sure. Do you think, and one of the other things as you were talking through that, and I was kind of thinking about this, was kind of like the idea of a specificity, like specific stiffness. So like would a sprinter or a different athlete have different stiffness needs that you would be looking for relative to what they're trying to do in their event or a specific discipline?
Yep. So, I have a sort of, this is an example actually from 20-odd years ago. I had a kid that was working, there was a squad, I was working in Australia, there was a squad of sprint athletes, pretty good caliber from probably 10.2 to 10.8 in the squad. So they were good caliber athletes. One of the athletes was probably the most powerful athlete in the group by a good margin. But he was a 10.79 100-meter runner. One of the slow guys in the group. But he had this phenomenal power qualities. And you put him in a double leg drop jump, he'd destroy everybody. But when we did anything single leg, he had these very weak, mushy feet. And he would collapse and would get destroyed by the 10.2 guys in the single leg stuff. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. And I probably didn't have at that point, the idea of how much you could train your feet and some of these other options that we could have done with that. So, and I kind of have some regrets for his career because he had these qualities, but he had a rate limiting step, and I think he was leaking energy through his feet, and so when you put him on a single leg, single support, he didn't have that strength to be able to deliver it quickly. And I think we let him down. An ultimate. He probably was who's to say he wasn't a 10 flat guy if we had all that sorted out. And that's it's not that we did it on purpose, but we didn't probably have the wherewithal to address that the way we should have. In hindsight.
Yeah, that is fascinating to me. And one of the things that I was kind of thinking about too, as you were going through that, was I don't know if this was your work that I had read this in. It was somewhere. It may have been your work. It may have been a Brett Contreras kind of write-up or roundup in sports science. But the idea of like vertical stiffness and horizontal stiffness not necessarily being the same thing. But what's your thoughts on that? And the single leg, double leg, that's the first time I'd heard that, but it makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure there is such a thing as vertical and horizontal stiffness is the quality of the leg spring. So I understand what they're trying to say, that in a certain plane you might have, might not be as stiff or reactive, in hip extension versus, maybe knee and ankle extension. I understand that, but stiffness is a quality of the spring itself, or the leg. I'm a little bit uneasy with that as an idea. But certainly we know people have strengths in horizontal or vertical, and I guess that relates a little bit to there's some of those Marin, or it might be a Rabita, it might be the primary author paper with showing that some of these 10-6 guys are producing as much power and force as the 10-2 guys, but they don't produce in the right direction. And perhaps there's the argument there that they're putting it vertically or making more braking forces, or they're not able to have that horizontal. And maybe there is a stiffness, for want of a better word, horizontal component there. But I just think that's a little bit messy as a concept.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. I understand with that. Yeah, that's something that even myself, I was kind of trying to think of and unpack exactly why that might be. I was thinking, like with the horizontal versus vertical, like I was thinking, sprinting, you have more the movement going on in the frontal plane in the foot than jumping and stuff like that. But I really like just keeping it simple, and not trying to, I can get way overly complex with things when I let my brain just kind of go. And I like the idea of keeping it simple, single, double leg. What were the things that you think were really at play with that guy who is off the charts on double, but yet when he goes to single, can't really get it done as well? Do you think it's more specific, like calf weakness, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, he sort of had those feet, just flat feet that would just collapse inwards. And I just think, maybe it's calf, maybe there's a whole lot of the muscular, the intrinsic muscles of the foot that we needed to work on. And certainly I would approach it differently now. And, you've had quite a few people that have addressed the foot on some of your podcasts. And, had we had some sort of resource like that to point it towards, and this was the same kid, he was a dynamite accelerator. Like he could out-accelerate anybody in the squad over 30, 40 metres, and then top end when the ground contact time and stiffness again becomes this real issue, they'd blow his doors off. And it wasn't that he didn't have good structure or good leg length, or he had all those things that were at least the equivalent of his peers, but wasn't able to get it done at the high speed. And I think had we had high speed footage, his ground contact times would have been impaired. And I think so. What exactly was in the foot, not 100% sure, but I'm certainly not claiming any expertise in that, but I do think we would have looked into it more deeply now and had tried to address it, because it was quite stark to me, and it's stupid that I didn't do something more about it at the time, but you live and learn.
Yeah. That's fascinating, though. It always makes me think about kind of the chicken or the egg, right? Like if someone is quote unquote weak in a movement, or are they sprinting that way because the muscle is weak, or did the muscle and pattern get not as strong because of the way they were running? I think a little bit about 100-meter guys who kind of towards the end of the race, like some of the shorter guys especially, they start to get eaten up, and they're not really getting eccentric through their glutes. Their footfall isn't quite out as far in front to the point where they're really developing that stiffness. It's kind of underneath and behind and quad dominant for a lot of people. And anyways, I just kind of wonder how chicken or the egg that is, when those guys don't have that stiffness and the the lack of the way they ran and all that.
Yeah, possibly there's an element of that. And for this guy, yeah, he probably did have some core dominance. That said, he had great glutes as well, so he certainly could extend his hip at speed. And I think, my gut feeling still is that it was his feet that let him down. And that if had we been a bit more astute about what we were doing, we would have done a better job, and he might have run professionally for a living rather than becoming a teacher and doing whatever else he ended up doing. A great guy that could have used a bit of help that we were, negligent. We just didn't know any better, So that's one of those things you look back on and think, well, that's something we didn't do everything we could have done, really.
Yeah, even still, I just think it's really cool how you've come to that point where, because a lot of people just look at a double leg RSI and say, oh, you're a stiff athlete, you're good to go. And I guess, maybe if the guy was like just a basketball player and that was it, maybe volleyball and that was it, maybe no one would ever have tested. Yeah.
He would be fine. Yeah, it wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, that's really cool in the specificity. I think it's cool things to think about. It reminded me a little bit too of like what Alex Natero is doing with like the single leg max press into the pins, like a plantar flexion, like the same kind of deal,
Totally, and I think that stuff would have been good. And I think had we had, that Marin paper I mentioned earlier with the stiffness from sprint data, I'm sure had we had that would have shown the same thing as the single leg drop jump showed. And we would have done things differently, perhaps. But yeah, we just didn't. We didn't. It literally was 20 years ago, so we didn't have that IP probably then. Yeah,
well, hey, I can't imagine hardly any of this advanced kind of data and kind of really hacking into those fine points of the sprint cycle was. People obviously were doing really good, but back then in many respects. But I don't think any of this stuff was really around.
And I think what you're seeing now is there's greater depth generally. We're not getting, you still need the freaks to run the 9.6s, the 9.7s, the 9.8s. But there's more guys now, it would seem to me, that can run 10.20, 10.10, 10 flat, because we are addressing some of these other anomalies, and we are understanding the little bits and pieces that maybe we weren't. There's more video footage and there's more data, so there's certainly more opportunity for people to be better. And they're probably more clean athletes now than there were 20, 30 years ago too, in terms of, and the people are achieving these things drug-free, which is great.
Yeah.
Just through better IP.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that last factor too is just huge. And I can't agree more. I do think the depth is becoming better because it's like all like the individual situations are able to be trained better than they were in the past.
Yeah, yeah, totally. It's good.
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking off that question, and this is almost in essence in a way like the difference between maybe doing like the isometric strength or super maximal strength based work in a rack, a safety rack, versus like a single leg depth jump training. But what's your thought on the interchange between like a super maximal eccentric work and plyometrics? And is there situations where you would look for one or the other, or is there progression between one or the other in particular athletes who need stiffness?
Yeah, it's actually a good question, and I think look, I'm still learning in the space too, so I would say that arguably both of them will impact stiffness positively. But in that aspect, they might be interchangeable, but they are still pretty different. I think plyos will train the stretch shortening cycle and the motor control strategies around that, and even within stretch shortening stuff, we know that there's a real specificity between long and short, and transfer isn't always great, and so in terms of ground contact time, if you're good at power bounding, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a great sprinter. Just means you're good at power bounding. So I think, plyos will help that force generation, the elastic qualities, and stiffness. And I've been listening to a little bit of Keith Barr's work. I don't know if you've come across his stuff, but he's a very smart scientist who's done a lot of this stuff with tendon health and muscle adaptation, mTOR, and he's been big on the gelatin and the use of that for tendon adaptation and stuff. And his stuff would argue, that the plyos might be the sort of reactive stuff which will really develop tendon stiffness, whereas the longer slower contractions might they'll still develop some stiffness, but they might actually work through a little bit more compliance as well. So you're breaking some of the bonds and rather than just having the sort of reactive stiffness of these interlinking fibers. So look, I think so. So to summarise that, the plyo stuff, I think yes, it will address stiffness. Yes, it will train the stretch shortening cycle and motor control strategies. The difference, I guess, is the eccentric stuff you can do other things as well. And so we know, and it's not to say plyos doesn't do this, we just probably don't have the data that shows it. There's certainly a couple of papers that show data that you can use high-speed eccentric work to change the morphology of the muscle towards a faster isoform. So you're more fast contracting protein in the muscle, which is great. So perhaps if I was going to periodize it, I might be doing some eccentric, super maximal eccentric work, maybe with some isometric work initially, because I think they marry in quite well together in terms of addressing some of those tendon properties. Then moving, and you could do it in conjunction with a small amount of plyos, and then you might morph towards faster eccentric work, and then morph towards more plyometric dominant work. But probably you'd keep a little bit of each element in throughout. And so I think that if we know that you may be able to, we think, who knows? It's all what do we know? I'm not sure. But we think you can address the muscle morphology with the eccentric training. You can probably set yourself up for some of these dramatic plyo stuff by actually the ability to develop eccentric strength. And I think in terms of degree of risk, there might be less risk in that for somebody initially going slow eccentrics, overloaded, incrementally developing that sort of integrity of the muscle and tendon unit, and then moving towards the plyos later on, which might be more specific. And then, obviously sprinting might be your final plyometric. And again, you wouldn't do none of it early, but you'd morph towards that.
Yeah, well, hey, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think that, like you kind of even said early on, like I don't think there's anyone right now that I've ever talked to who really has those two in these perfect buckets, on exactly what they do and exactly when to use them. I think we're still learning a whole lot, and I really like the way that you had put that together. I had asked that too. I'd actually asked Dan Fichter on a prior podcast kind of about that, and where he had kind of stuck with plyometrics in favor of it, which has been my stance lately, just because I feel like I haven't learned enough about the method and done it myself enough to feel comfortable. That's part of the reason I'm asking you guys these questions as well, just to learn a little bit more about the sequence.
Just to sort of think about this thinking out loud a little bit. I mean, there's also the impact, the idea that some people don't tolerate that eccentric stuff. The plyometric stuff all that easily, and they might have some congenital reason for not doing it. And I remember reading. I think it was a New Studies in Athletics way back in the day. There was some, you've probably read it, stuff on Jonathan Edwards. He had a training diary that was in there, and I don't think they specified exactly what but he was told by the orthopedic surgeon, triple jumps, your body's going to break. It might be something issue or whatever it was. Scoliosis. I have no idea actually. I'm just making that up. But there was some orthopedic issue. So he didn't do boatloads of plyometrics like most triple jumpers you'd think would do. And he found a different way of answering the question, and he did it by getting silly strong. This was a 74-kilo guy powering more than twice body weight, and so that gave him these eccentric qualities. And again, in hindsight, there might have been better ways of doing it again. Maybe he was an 1850 triple jumper had he done, that's historical fact that he didn't do that plyometric. He did a lot of strength work instead, and obviously had a remarkable career. So kind of interesting. So this, horses for courses. You would decide on your protocol and your training based on what they can and can't cope with, and some will do more. And another one would be, I work with some throw athletes, and to do truckloads of plyometrics when you weigh 130 kgs, or 300 odd pounds or whatever, it's pretty hard on the body because those impact forces are huge. Whereas we can control it more in an eccentric fashion with some overloaded work.
Yeah, I like the Jonathan Edwards example, especially too. I mean, obviously someone who's so successful, but it seems like the more track people I talk to and the more anecdotes I get, it's like so many great performances and PRs always come out of I got hurt, I got sick, I had to do something else, and just like the thought of too, like if you've been doing plyos for 20 years or 10 years or whatever. You know, super maximal is probably going to give you good results because it's a different way of, if you didn't do any plyos and just did super max, you'd probably do well with it. Like you just variation and
and you have those motor patterns from the 20 years of plyos in the system. So then you change the stimulus, get a bit more adaptation in a slightly different fashion, and you can still use that motor program you've got because you've done it for 20 years, and you probably will improve. I think there's a lot to be said for a little bit of variation. Certainly. That's been one of the changes I've made in the way I've been periodizing the last year is more frequent variation and I think it's just interesting because there's so many people, you listen to different people's takes on that and everybody does it differently. There's no right or wrong, but there probably is a right or wrong for a given athlete and sometimes you get lucky with the way you program works well for an athlete and it doesn't make you a great coach. It just means you got lucky.
Yes.
We all get lucky from time to time. And probably the same program doesn't work for another athlete. And then you need to, the great coaches have that intuition to change that probably quicker than I do, and they get there quicker. And so, we're all learning and hoping to get to that mastery stage at some point.
Yeah. Well, hey, speaking of what you just said too, I'd really love to get into my next question was actually a little bit about kind of breaking down how long you can do eccentric work and dosage but actually I would like if you could follow up a little bit on kind of some of the recent ways you've been tweaking the work and periodizing it and changing it. I'd be fascinated in that and how you're kind of changing the stimulus over the year.
Yeah, well, I guess I used to be. Well, I still do this with some developmental athletes. They're still using more of a sort of relatively straightforward block type periodization, and I just think you get to a point where you have a few weeks of the same stimulus and you get stale, as we've all seen. And I was listening to actually Louis Simmons' podcast. I don't even remember who it was with, but it was some. Louis Simmons was talking about their system, and I've been aware of that stuff for years and years, and I've played with it. But one of the things that he struck home to me was his comment on as people get more advanced, they instead of changing, they have a max effort day or whatever, and they change the max effort exercise every week because they get stale. And great, that makes a lot of sense, and I totally get that. But a developmental athlete might stick on the same max effort exercise for 3 weeks. Okay, cool. So I started thinking about what would happen if you change the whole paradigm every week, and you changed, instead of having 3, 4 week, 6 week blocks, you had 1 week blocks, and then you repeated that, and you multiplied that over, and that's what I've been playing with. So I've been doing essentially a 4 week block on repeat with a different block each week within that subset of that. And hey, look, with some athletes it's worked great. Others, they feel like they don't get enough time on a stimulus, and that, so yeah, it's horses for courses. It's not right or wrong, but I think in terms of a developed athlete, change the stimulus regular basis is a good thing, and that's probably what I've moved more towards in this last year or two, or year probably. And some people it's worked really well for, and I've been quite astounded at the changes we've got in a 6-month period for senior athletes that are already at a world level. So it's been cool.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I've been thinking a lot too about just the idea of changing the block every week from it was back when I was 21. I was listening to someone that was the first seminar I'd ever went to. It was like Perform Better something or other, and the guy is literally like, this guy comes in, he's like, we don't repeat the same workout for like 40 days or something. And he's like, here's all these great gains we made. And I was like, really? Like, how could you do like, but I think something that was more practical was I had Walt Klein on about 20 episodes ago, and he was talking about like a 4-week block with each week having a different emphasis, like kind of like what you were just saying, like the first week being maybe a max strength, the first week being hypertrophy, second week strength, next week power, next week kind of an unload, or at least tilted towards that. And that's been an interesting thought for me. I even as older athletes too, like they adapt so fast. I was writing about I just kind of was messing around about 6 weeks ago and went out to the track with an intern and just did this crazy workout where we just did a bunch of like kettlebell springs and dropped the kettlebell and sprinted, and then we did goblet squats and sprinted up the stadiums, and I felt so good. The next day I was jumping like higher than I jumped in months, and it was just this new stimulus. But then by the second or third time I'd done the workout, I already kind of adapted to it a little bit. Like I wasn't getting that anymore.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, it's, and I don't know whether I've listened to some of the stuff you had. Christian Tudo, that's how you pronounce it, neurotyping stuff. And I'll be honest, I'm a bit of a skeptic that you can define everybody in 5 different personality types. It sounds, but hey, look, I'm sure there's some real valid stuff in there. But it might be, and in his setup, that you might have somebody that's one neurotype likes that rapid change all the time, and that's, I'm sure he would say that, and he's probably right. And he knows a lot more about that stuff than I do. So my skepticism is probably based on ignorance as well. So, but it seems like, you need to find what works for an athlete, and some of them will. And the athletes, I think, as they get older, need to be actively engaged and be excited about their program. They need to be going, hey, well, I want to try this, and okay, we can do that. We can morph this, and it becomes it's a collaboration rather than a dictatorship, which you might have with a 16-year-old. You might be just saying, you can do this, this, and this. I think people probably do morph towards what they like, and sometimes they need to do that, but also sometimes they need to do the shit they don't like and really adapt and move on.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, I know. I did some work with fiber typing and genetic, or not fiber typing, genetic typing, and I paid to get the test or whatever, and I have the gene for like the high novelty seeking, and it's like I have those athletes I know have that too for sure, and I feel like they would be the ones as well who would love that very different block, and I think I would do really well in that. I'm sure there's more to it than that, but that's been something that I've kind of thought about a little bit too, in addition with the neurotyping, the types there and how that fits in.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. Like people, there's a certain amount of skepticism around. Oh, look, if I don't do this exercise, how am I going to improve on it? You're only doing it once every 4 or 5 weeks. I understand that, but what we've found is, well, if you get generically better, if you're doing that exercise for X number of years, that'll come up too, and it does. And that's been kind of an eye-opener for some of our athletes that, oh, look at that. I haven't done, let's say power cleans or whatever it might be, and I've just done a PB, which has been stuck on that PB for 5 years, 3 years, whatever it might be. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting aspect of the field. It makes it a lot more fun too. Maybe confusing sometimes if we rack our brains, but it makes it fun.
Yeah, exactly. And you still have to have a plan. And like, I wouldn't go through the whole season like that. I would do that as a preparatory block of maybe 4 lots of 4 weeks in a 16-week block, something like that, maybe, or 12 weeks or however you're going to figure it out. And then you might still have a traditional in-season maintenance type comp prep, whatever, approach from there. So, but yeah, who's to say everybody's got their own ways of cutting it, didn't they? So that's what we've played with anyway.
Yeah. Well, regardless, it's great to hear kind of how you had just said, like, some athletes responded well, some didn't, because you'll get like people like that at that seminar that I went to when I was 21 who shows up and is like, we do something different every day, and here's some results. But that's only part of the story. Maybe it worked well for, maybe there was a lot of people who could have done better on a different program, and maybe for a couple of people that was the best that they could have done. So
yeah, exactly. So hard to say.
Yeah, I love that stuff. So fiber type 2, that's something I wanted to get to, and you had alluded to it a little bit with the super maximal and its effect on that. But what's your take on an athlete's fiber type or estimated fiber type percentage, and how you might train based off that? So if you have an estimate of what they might be, does that play into your training program?
Yes and no, I guess. Like everybody, I work only in power events now, so I'm not really after fatigue resilience. So everybody, we're trying to morph them towards a faster muscle, even if they are, really twitchy already. So yeah, do I train somebody with a slow twitch dominance differently? Not necessarily. I might a little bit.
Yeah.
I might really emphasise that. Not going to the fatigue and the grinding stuff. With that athlete more so than somebody that's just jumping out of the gym, explosive as hell. Perhaps got insulin resistance, and that gives you shift towards fast twitch muscle as well. And so yes, maybe. But for the most part, with everybody, you're trying to go towards this, sort of faster isoform. And with that in mind, I think there are things like we know we've talked about fast eccentric work. We know rest is another one where you can throw more rest in. You're probably going to get less down regulation of fast twitch muscle. I mean, I guess that's the other point is, when I was studying originally, and we were sort of told there's this immutable characteristic of fibre type that didn't change, and you had what you had, and that was that. And since then, there's been more and more stuff come out, and we know that if you heaven forbid, you break your back and you're disabled from the legs down, within 12 months, you'll be nearly 100% fast twitch 2B muscle in your quads or wherever they biopsy, but in that denervated area of the body. And so, to me, that says we are plastic. It's completely plastic. The fibre type can change. It's just that some people are more resilient towards maintaining their fibre populations than others, and that might be what talent is. That might be that for in a fast twitch event, you can do all the work and you get strong and train hard and do all that stuff, and you're still really fast twitch. And certainly, I think that is the case with some athletes, that they have this resilience to training, that they don't down-regulate the same way as the next person might. And so that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I'm waffling now, but there is there is a change that's available, but how you do it will depend on the situation to a certain extent, and the athlete you have in front of you. So for example, I had a guy that I did a little bit of work with back in the day, who was a New Zealand guy that he ran 10.17, I think. So he's pretty quick, and he could train him quite hard, and he would still be really explosive. Whereas some of his peers in his training group, you do heaps of strength work, and they would not be explosive because they'd just be cooked and or down regulating that fast twitch muscle. So that was a certain talent that he had, I would say, in that space.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. It's like athletes who, no matter what you throw at them, they're still going to be able to keep that pretty well. I almost was thinking about it in terms of detraining too. Like, I know, like for me, if I don't sprint or jump for a while or be explosive, I lose so fast. Like I feel like faster than everybody else. It's like crazy. It's like reverse. I don't know how that works into it, but
yeah, and I think that's true. I think there are some people that detrain faster than others, and certainly, and whether it's that you become a very whether that's a fibre type thing, which I doubt. I think it's more likely that you're a really fascial animal, and so you lose a bit of tension and tightness in your system, and so you become kind of floppy, for want of a better word, would be my guess, with the people that do that really quickly. So they don't all of a sudden you don't bounce very well, and so then you feel like and maybe it relates to that whole the Franz Bosch muscle slack concept. Perhaps, and you develop this slack that you didn't have, whereas other people, you get them to sit down and do nothing for 2 weeks, and they absolutely go off. They come out of that and they're doing PVs out of yin yang on they just, so that they're doing, everything goes off, and they do personal bests and this, that, and the other straight after an illness or whatever, as you sort of mentioned before. So I don't think that really rapid detraining, as you call it, is necessarily a function of muscle, and this is just gut feeling rather than anything super scientific, but I think it's a loss of tension in the spring and maybe the fascia, and that's my gut feeling, because I think the muscle for most people would be moving towards the right direction, and or if you detrain and your strength reserve isn't very high, you can get below the strength reserve needed to produce these power qualities, and then you've got a problem too. So, yeah, lots of answers to that, I suppose.
Oh, yeah, a lot of different ways to get to that. But no, you're probably right out with me in the fascial-driven thing. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's the main engine that I run on. So,
and it would tie in with what you said earlier, that you did that sort of, almost, CrossFit volume type stimulus, and that probably gave you some tension in the spring, and the next day you're jumping out of the gym. Or, you're probably a guy that needs a little bit of load to get that tone. And certainly, again, I've had athletes in that space that you need to work them through into a competition, and others that work them through to a competition, they're cooked, and you need to back them off dramatically from 2 or 3 weeks out, and they do a lot of sitting on their ass and reading books or playing PlayStation or whatever they do, and then they come out and just go berserk.
That makes perfect sense. That's crazy. It's amazing. I never really thought of it in those exact terms, but it makes all the sense in the world. I know, like one of the best track meets I ever had was the coach just randomly decided to have us run really fast 200s on a Thursday. The meet was on a Saturday. I wore spikes and just blasted the 200s on fairly short rest, really fast, and was jumping probably the highest I ever. My calves were so sore though I could barely even move. But despite all that, I was still the highest I'd ever been over 6'11". There's a picture. I was like, man, it's too bad my calves hurt so bad. But yeah, I've always operated like that. Or just playing basketball. I'm not trying to steer this podcast into Joel's personal. How can I be the most athletic? That's why I'm getting all you guys.
No, that's we know ourselves better than anything else, and that stuff is. Was I'm the opposite. I'm this naturally very tight person, and when I rested, I probably got a little bit more compliance, and probably that I was. I had a stress fracture, come out on a stress fracture, I'll be going off, six weeks off, doing no real work, and on happy days, I'm good to go. So, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it even takes me into, like, Randy Huntington's episode just came out. He's working with sprinters and jumpers over in China and getting some amazing...
He's doing some great work there, isn't he?
Yeah, his guys are doing pretty good, I'd say. He was saying how his sprinters, the super fast-twitch sprinters tend to be a 3-day-a-week, where they get a little more rest in between each day, where the jumper, if you're more of a jumper type, you have 4 days where you have a little rest in between each day. So maybe that's it too, because if you're a jumper, you're maybe more fascially driven, less rest, same deal on a micro scale. It makes sense to me. Cool. Well, hey, next question. So kind of talking a little bit into what's your use, or when do you find or when do you decide to use like velocity-based training, Tendo's Gym Aware, tagging the bar with speed when athletes are in the weight room? What are some principles and protocols you go to there?
So that's, to be fair, I've probably been something of a late engager with that, but have engaged in it now. And look, I think it relates again to that stuff we've just been talking about. That, and as far as if you're trying to do, we know there's a couple of papers that came out. I think Pablo Blanco 2016 paper with something like 20% drop off in speed versus 40% drop off in speed, and they showed that if you limit the drop off in speed if you're doing a set to 20%, you don't decrease fast twitch fiber percentage. This is from a legit biopsy study. Whereas if you do go to 40%, so you're grinding reps at the end of a set, then perhaps you are compromising fiber type. And to me, that makes quite good sense. So we've sort of set some targets for that. We're in a block where we're working with the power speed athletes. Let's not try and depress fiber type. So you set a tight margin, 10% drop off, 20% drop off, whatever, something in that range, and many reps. You can keep repping till we say stop. And it usually doesn't. For the real fast twitch guys, it's not very many reps anyway, depending on the load you're using. But I find it that's highly motivating too. If you're calling out rep speed, it's got to stay over X meters per second, and you're calling out speed, it's got to be over 1.5, and you're 1.6, 1.58, 1.58, stop, and whatever it is. And they set PVs in terms of how many reps they can do at X weight with X speed, and it becomes more focused on the speed than necessarily just grinding away at trying to do a strength PV, which, as we know, strength is reasonably specific to the velocity you do it at. And if you're a jab and throw or a shot put or anybody, you're still moving your joints at extremely high speed and release velocity that they get to, and grinding a bench press at 0.3 of a meter per second is probably of limited relevance to even a shot putter. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So I have been using it in that fashion, and I think I'll continue to grow in my use of it. But I'm certainly intrigued at the value it offers there in terms of maintaining vibe type and or performance.
Yeah, sure thing. I had heard about the 20 and 40% thing, and I in the past, and my thought was like, wow, like 20% seems kind of like a lot. Like that seems like a lot slower, and you're still maintaining it. So I'm like, well, that's cool. You have a little bit of a cushion there.
yeah, exactly. It's still 20% is quite a lot slower, and yeah, it's interesting. Like, and certainly you can even characterize athletes by what percentage, how much they drop off. If you go from 1 RM to 80%, how many reps you can do it above a given speed at 80%. Yeah, it's certainly big differences between athletes, dramatic. So, which is quite cool. I've got some of the kayak. I don't work with kayak, but some of the kayak athletes in sea training, they can grind all day at 85%. They probably do 20 reps. It's amazing. So, yeah, quite cool.
Yeah, I think it was in block periodization or something where like how slow twitch those athletes are. I heard some Russian talk on how they were trying to increase the slow twitch in those kayakers, and I was like, that was the first I ever heard of like, you want to increase your slow twitch? I was like, what? But they were like, that was like their goal in this Russian. I forget if it was Selinev or Valnisedkin, and one of those guys. They were talking about that, and that was crazy. But that's just another good thing for coaches to keep in mind too on the differences in athletes, and just more good information too, how quickly they drop off.
Yeah, so it's just another assessment tool, isn't it? That you might find, you might morph that as they develop. That might change as well. So it's cool.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, absolutely. Angus, thoughts on the use of cluster training in weightlifting? Is that something that you use commonly with your athletes, cluster weight training?
No, I haven't used it a lot, but have been talking about it a lot, and sort of a little bit again in the same space that, in that, you talked about doing perhaps doing a hypertrophy, back strength, et cetera, et cetera. If you were doing it in that fashion, in those short blocks, you wanted to do hypertrophy without, and we know hypertrophy training generally down regulates our fastest muscle. Maybe the cluster training offers a good option for essentially doing exactly what the VBT stuff is showing us, that you keep the speed, you still do a lot of volume, but you keep the speed by having, you might do sets of 3 with 15-second rests and a set of 9 reps or whatever it might be, 3 sets of 3. So you're getting the volume in, but you're not doing this really crappy rep quality where you just do the slow grinding stuff. So look, I think it's got a lot to offer, and hypertrophy adaptations without loss of contractile speed and quality for the populations I work with. Yeah, that's a great tool that can be used in that space, I think.
Yeah, in terms of barbell work too for speed and power athletes, and how often are you going higher than 5 reps in a set for these guys? I know we talked about velocity decrement a little bit. So with everything kind of in mind that you've just talked about, how much space is there for the reps higher than that in what you're doing, or maybe even a similar time under tension construct?
Not much, to be honest. And it's not to say never, but we do very little in that sort of high rep range, particularly if they're a senior athlete with the right anthropometry already. They're already big enough and ugly enough to do what they need to do. Then and we might have one day in the week where we do a little bit more volume stuff, but that might be 5s or 6s on that one day in terms of reps. But yeah, you don't see. I'm never prescribing 15s or 20s or anything like that. And it's not to say there's not value in that. It's just not in my toolkit at the moment. And I have been intrigued by seeing how strong some of these CrossFit athletes get, and certainly they do boatloads of reps.
Mm-hmm.
They're strong, but are they explosive would be my next question though. And that's not the wheelhouse. I don't want strong. I want strong and explosive. So until I find a rationale for going there, haven't done a lot in that space. You might have an athlete that needs it, and you might have identified a weak link in the chain that might need a bit of work, and it might be a relatively slow twitch muscle that you want to address. It might be a postural muscle and they're losing. It might be it's in that space, well, you might do it then. But in terms of the global movements that are power orientated, no, I don't really see the value.
Yeah. I thought about that myself. Like those CrossFit athletes can get really strong. I know they're not very good at running though. Their running is form wise is terrible. So I don't know what kind of indicator that is. Always distance running with them. Like they, however many miles is part of what they do. But I would imagine their speed and jumping is not, truly that great.
No, I wouldn't think so. I sort of I have an image in my mind when I was still training myself at a reasonably decent level, with watching a bodybuilder come and do it. We had some inter-faculty competition, and there's a bodybuilder from I think randomly enough the pharmacy faculty, so you do maths on that one. He was trying to do an overhead shot put throw, and this guy was huge. He was probably 6'2" and 140 kilos bodybuilder, huge guy, 300 pounds in your language, and was pitiful. Did like an 11-meter overhead with a 7K shot, and that was like, oh wow, just couldn't move quickly. So and that that's the natural extension of that question, I suppose. That high reps to failure, you become this big grinding giant, but perhaps not all that useful in a performance modality.
Yeah, I agree. It takes you back to, I remember I watched one of my former coworkers was in a little CrossFit competition about 45 minutes north of here, and it was like they started with a 4-mile run, did a few strength WODs or whatever, and then they ran a 100-meter dash. Like that was part of the competition. I was like, how many hamstrings are we going to see fall off here? And they ran it like 3 times. It was like an elimination round, and I only think 2 people pulled their hamstring, which I actually think is miraculous. I feel like their bodies were just down regulating automatically to keep themselves healthy or something. But that was
they're probably running them in 14 seconds anyway, so the risk might have been reasonably low. So who knows?
Yeah, that was crazy. I was definitely afraid there for a minute. So last question I got for you, Angus, is just thoughts on EMS training electrostim for the purpose of increased rate of force development. Thoughts on that training concept?
Yeah, look, I think theoretically it makes a lot of sense, and look, I've played with it a little bit. Had a rower actually several years ago where we tried it, who was great endurance-wise, not so explosive, and we did through EMS on top of his normal training program. Because there's that whole concept of preferential recruitment of fast twitch muscle with EMS, and it's on the basis of where the electrode sending out the current into the muscle. Well, you're actually depolarizing the motor neurons in that proximity. And the bigger the motor neurons are, the more easy to depolarize they are. The bigger ones are typically fast switch motor units, etc., etc. So you get this reverse order recruitment, the opposite of the Henman size principle. Now, it's not entirely true, because you also anything that's in close proximity to the electrode will be depolarized, even smaller motor neurons. But there's something in there. So in that space, that's logically it makes sense. And there are a couple of the paper that sort of got me interested originally. There's a Delitto paper, it's a case study, and I think it's 1989, Delitto et al. They had an Olympic weightlifter, and they showed this data from these blocks of electrical stim stuff in there, and this was a guy that was obviously pretty blooming strong, and he was doing dramatic gains when he was doing EMS at sort of probably extremely high currents. He was getting, it was just an MVC leg extension, I think, an isometric stimulation, and he was getting numbers that were beyond his MVC from memory. So the electrical stim was allowing him to drive his muscle hard, but his voluntary stuff good. So kind of intriguing, and certainly he seemed to progress every time he did it. And we don't do 2 or 3 week blocks, I think, from memory, and then maybe 6 weeks training without it, and another week. The problem with it is it's at that sort of intensity, it's quite draining. And the rower I was talking about that I used it on, we followed that sort of same sort of protocol. At the end of the 2 weeks, he's coming out and he's breaking into a sort of sympathetic sweat before he puts the electrodes on, because he knows how uncomfortable it's going to be. And it was brutal. But every time we did it, he got an improvement in his vertical jump, which was kind of cool. And albeit his vertical jump was pretty mud to start with, and it didn't, and he wasn't going to be dunking anytime soon or reverse, but it improved every time we did it by a centimetre or two. So look, I think there is something in it. With elite power athletes, that DeLitto paper was certainly pretty dramatic. There's another paper which I dug up recently, Slinkus or something like that. It's I think a Lithuanian paper when they used sprinters. It's a recent paper, 2017, and they used a sprint population and they dancing. They were national level guys, and they showed gains in I think they simulated the foot and calf, and they showed gains in speed, both 0 to 10 and flying 10 meter times. And the guys were decent. I think that they were under a second or just on a second 0.99 or something like that for the mean of the group by the post testing. So they were 10 meter per second guys. They weren't beginners by any stretch. So the fact that those guys were getting adaptation bodes well. And I guess you need to look at protocols and how you're doing it and why you're doing it. But have played with it a little bit more. What's the best stimulator? I don't really know. We bought a couple of relatively cheap stimulators and ended up flying them up after about a month. So that wasn't much good. I guess you've seen the ARP wave and that sort of stuff with the Jay Schroeder and co. Haven't used it, don't know what it's like. You can't find any information on what the stimulation frequency is, what the hertz, what the current going through it. Seems to be very cloak and dagger, which always worries me. But obviously they feel they've got some IP there that is worth protecting, and good luck to them. But haven't used that sort of stuff, and there may be some further advantages there that I'm totally unaware of.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear a lot of those research ideas there, and I for me, it's like I'm just trying to find the time myself to use it a lot before I would. I think a lot of people who do prescribe it initially use it on themselves and they got something good out of it. I'm still kind of waiting for that, but I feel like maybe I haven't done it complete justice either. But maybe being more fascially driven, who knows? Maybe it's different for me. But it's I was thinking about. Sorry, go ahead.
I tried it. So with this rower, I was doing it with the rowers at the same time because we were both learning at the same time. And I tried it with a whole group of people, and certainly some people are responders to it and some aren't. Like I could get, if I was stimulating my quad, this is just the complex, pretty standard complex stimulator. I was getting beyond my MVC with a leg extension with the complex stimulator, which is kind of interesting. Whereas other people would get to 30% of their MVC. And so so if you're not getting a good output, my guess is your muscle tension is one of the things which dictates adaptation. So I would say that maybe it's not your gig, and maybe I just had quite peripheral nerve endings or that were accessible, so I did respond to it. But some of the other people I used got almost nothing out of it. And interestingly, when I used it on people with an injury, like if you had an ACL injury, how you've actually quad atrophies within sort of 10 seconds of surgery, it seems like. they would get almost, you must get this, the dendrites of the motor neurons must all sort of shrivel up and die a little bit from that stuff too, because it was very hard to stimulate those guys. If you put a current on their good leg, and they'd be almost hyperextending their knee, the tension would be so hard, and then put it on their injured leg with the same current, and almost not even a contraction. It was bizarre that we get neuroatrophy as well as the muscle atrophy all seem to go hand in hand. So it's certainly interesting, and I would love to learn more about it, and I would love to know what the best stimulator is and all that sort of stuff. But I haven't got many great answers for you on that space.
Yeah, there's so much to learn about the body, right? Like, there's only so much time and so many things. But just the what you have there, it actually inspires me to think. And even that sprint study, it's like, well, and I've always kind of thought, well, if I just do my quads, if all I have time for is my hamstrings and quads, like I'm not really doing everything justice. There's more muscles and sprinting I need to do. But just
that's right.
Like like you're saying with the guy whose feet were a little bit softer, that sprinter who was the 10-7 sprinter guy, and that sprint study, I was like, well, that's a real, it is really simple just to do calves and gastrocs or whatever. Like that would be a simple place to start and kind of see what happens. So it's kind of cool.
We could have done a lot worse. As I look back at that, exactly, you're right. That might have been a great stimulus. Put someone pads on his feet, put someone on his calves, and all that tricep zero area, and you'd be certainly we would be better off than we were, I'm sure.
Yeah, I love it. Well, maybe I'll run an experiment. I'll put it in the show notes in a few months if something happens of it. But that sounds cool. Awesome, inspiring information, Angus. Again, that's last of the questions I had today. But man, it's great talking to you. I feel like you're inside my head on some of the stuff with like the fascial driven and the. It's just so cool to hear about the work you're doing, your anecdotes, and your knowledge of the research. So, hey, thanks for being on. Thanks for coming back. Really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. Cheers.
Hey, thanks for tuning in for another episode. I hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did putting it together. Just such cool information from all these coaches. And if you work with anyone who wants to get faster, I can't imagine that you don't have tons of tools and ideas in your toolbox to make that happen and give athletes a better experience and help them to be the best they can be. So we'll be back next week with another great guest. If you have a few minutes, would really appreciate it if you took the time to leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever you're listening on. It's the best way you can support us is just spreading the message of these coaches with as many other coaches as possible who want to hear it and implement these training methods. So also, don't forget to visit our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology, Freelap, GymAware, K-Box, Force Plates, EMS, and they have the best of in each training tech category. So check them out as well as their excellent blog. We'll see you guys next week.